All right, well, good morning and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Today, we're gonna be doing a fireside chat with Jason Feng, Zeplin's Director of Growth Marketing. Zeplin is a collaboration tool for design and development teams, and Jason works there running growth campaigns. Previously, he's worked at really great companies like Namely, Medallia, Uber Freight, and Guideline. We'll sort of briefly touch on his background, but I want you to think of this more as a conversation. He's gonna share a quick presentation about kind of his evolution in building out a data stack. But I want to sort of start just very briefly with my own personal history here with growth marketing. So my career started as a data analyst, and I would work really closely with our marketing teams. And the way that I would work closely with the marketing teams would be I would be essentially assigned to them as a customer, and me as a data person would walk over to the marketing team, and they would sort of share their problems. And then I would take those problems, think about them really deeply, run off and go to a corner and write queries and come back with answers, and then hand them a list of answers for them to take action on. But that's a really dated approach. Unsurprisingly, a lot of kind of my early career history is now dated. But I wanted to share that I think of that as a dated approach, which is kind of why actually we've invited Jason to come give a talk about what growth marketing looks like today. So with that, and without too much fanfare or introduction, Jason Feng.
Hey everyone, thanks for attending, and thank you for the introduction, Peter. So I'm here to kind of give my talk on my story about how Zeplin built their growth marketing stack, and how we took all these different data sources and were able to kind of integrate it all in one unified quote unquote like source of truth, and how like all these new technologies have come in the last few years, have just made the whole process much simpler. So I have some slides, and I can just hop straight in there. And then if you have any questions, I believe you can just put them right into the webinar chat. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to start with a bit of history in how I, as like a B2B marketer, have built like the marketing data stack from roughly around like 2015 to 2020. So this was what I like to think of as like the prehistoric B2B marketing data stack. And how it worked was essentially at all these companies that I've worked at, Salesforce was basically the source of truth for all of our data. So Salesforce contained stuff like, obviously the sales stuff like prospective accounts, contacts, contained all this marketing activity and sales activity that these different departments were generating. It contained our opportunities. It contained our customers and all of their contracts. So what SKU did a customer buy? What features have customers purchased, as well as the health of the customer and renewals. So like when does the contract end, and how happy are our customers? So all this data was stored in Salesforce, and we referenced it. So the next question is, well, how did all this data get into Salesforce? And basically, Salesforce was almost like a vacuum. We had a bunch of other tools that collected telemetry on all these different data points, and we sent them into Salesforce. And now, unsurprisingly, there were some issues that came up with that. And essentially, the issues were broken down in kind of three categories. So first was that we just had a ton of CSVs. So Salesforce was never meant to be a data vacuum. So we just had a lot of different data files, a lot of CSV files that ended up being put into Salesforce. We also set up many Zapier integrations, and the data never synced quite correctly the way we wanted. The second issue was that we were kind of stringing together integrations. So in the previous slide, I had shown that we collected data using all these various tools, and then data went into Salesforce. The integration, if the integration didn't always work correctly, no one actually knew where the correct number was. So you would have one number in Salesforce, a second number in HubSpot, and this be like basic information, like how many opportunities are there, how many opportunities are in pipeline. No one knew where the correct data actually was, and that led to, well, you can probably guess, a lot of problems. And then the final thing was that we were kind of limited in analytics. Salesforce had a custom reporting function that wasn't really meant to process massive amounts of data. So what we ended up doing was this, we had these massive spreadsheets that we would pass around. These were Google Sheets that took 2 minutes to load. And if a bad change ever happened, that would break the entire thing. So I've spent many days and nights fixing these massive spreadsheets. And then when I had joined Zeplin back in 2020, I kind of took a look around at basically what the state of the market was, what Zeplin's internal needs were. And I realized that this state of the world centered around Salesforce was just not sustainable. So one, there was much better technology available on the market in 2020 than there was in 2015. Two was that Zeplin had a pretty unique business. We had like a very high volume of just customers and prospects. And we had this self-service business where people could make a B2B transaction without ever talking to an account executive. Three was that we had to do a lot. The marketing team was responsible for the health of the self-serve business. And the self-serve analytics that we were doing were pretty complicated, and they were just not going to be able to be supported if we were going to maintain massive spreadsheets. And then finally, we had a pretty small team. I think when I joined Zeplin, we were around like 50 to 60 people. And therefore, we couldn't we didn't have the resources to maintain our own in-house data team. So what we came up with was that we looked at the market, and we were like, oh, well, there's this trend that's been coming around called data warehouses. So essentially what a data warehouse was that you took all these tools that were collecting customer data. Data warehouse would extract the data from all these tools. It would extract the data from all these tools. And a data warehouse was essentially just a collection of tables. We would have some sort of automated sync that would bring in the latest data on a scheduled cadence. And then because all of this data was just in the same location, we were able to easily combine the data from these various places for reporting. So for example, we could look at our Salesforce data, which contained our prospects, together with our amplitude data, which contained data around what the prospects actually did in application. And then we could determine, well, which one of our prospects were most likely to convert based on what they were doing in the free version of our product. So we decided we're going to build this. We're going to build this data warehouse, and essentially, when we were thinking about how we would build this data warehouse, we had kind of just 3 ways to go about it. So the 3 ways were we could DIY it, we could learn how to build a data warehouse and just build it ourselves. The second was we could hire a consultant who could help us do this work. And there's a lot of data warehouse consultants. And then the third was we could go with Mozart data. And then there were pros and cons to each. And this is roughly how we thought about the pros and cons. So with DIY, we would have more control, but we didn't have the in-house expertise, and it would take a while for us to learn how to do it. And we would take away from engineering time, take away from time from all of our departments. With a consultant, we could hire the expert who did bring expertise. But part of the thing with hiring consultants is that somebody needs to manage the consultant, and somebody needs to make decisions internally. And in order to manage the consultant and make these decisions on what we wanted, we actually needed somebody with we actually needed somebody with expertise to manage a consultant. So that was kind of like the chicken and egg problem that we were running into with the idea of hiring a consultant, because we just didn't have the expertise and we didn't know what we really wanted from the data warehouse. And then lastly, it was just a little bit slow. It took, our estimates were like 2 to 3 months to build. And then the final solution was that, we got in touch with Mozart Data, and and how we thought about it was like Mozart Data came with a pretty opinionated view on what should be in the data stack. Their experts were like, okay, a data stack should be able to do these 3 things, and here's how we want to do it. So it was a pretty opinionated view, and it offered everything that we needed. They were also able to just get off the ground pretty quickly because it was more productized than, say, building a data warehouse from scratch. And then the downside that we saw was that we just had like less control over the individual components of the data warehouse. But we thought that was something that we were pretty comfortable with, given like their expertise and their like viewpoint on what should be in the data stack. And since we didn't really have the expertise there, this is the option that we went with. So that was kind of how we thought about building a data warehouse. And then the next slide, I'm gonna just go through, like, 9 months in with Mozart. This is kind of like what our data stack sort of looks like at the moment. So we have a bunch of data sources. These are just some of them. So we have like transaction data from Stripe. We have our backend data from Mongo. We have all of our sales and marketing data and product data from Salesforce, Mixpanel, and Intercom. And then Mozart handles the extraction, storage, and transform of this data. So what that means is essentially Mozart pulls in this data on a scheduled basis. Mozart stores this data, and then the transform is when we take the data, we clean it, we join it against each other, so we can look at like various metrics. So Mozart handles those 3 functions. And then further down, basically we take the data that's in Mozart and we do 2 things with it. One is we do like analytics and visualization. So here we use like a business intelligence tool called Metabase to handle the analytics and visualization. And the other thing that we do with data is enrichment. So what enrichment means is, let's say you had like a record in Salesforce and you wanted to know, well, what is this? What is Jason doing in Mixpanel? Enrichment is just taking our transformed data and sending it back to Salesforce, so that some salesperson, for example, could look at the record and be able to get a whole view of the customer from all the other data sources. And this was just useful because we didn't want all of our staff to go through the actual data warehouse to be able to get a view of the customer. So Mozart is kind of like at the center of all of our different SaaS tools on the left side. And then Mozart, grabs the data, cleans it, stores it, and then we're able to take that clean data and send it over to our visualization tools, and then enrich our SaaS tools with a more full view of the customer. So now, we have all this visualization, we have all this enrichment. Now the next question is like, well, what are we doing with this data? Like, what are some of the questions we've answered? So here are some of like the questions that we have answered. And I think these are pretty diverse questions that are like pretty interesting to us. So some of the questions are around how do we think about pricing and packaging. So one example is that Zeplin has a free plan, and the way the free plan works is we want users to use the free plan to a certain point, And then we want to introduce like limits on the free plan in order to monetize the users. So one of the questions is like, if we're going to monetize, what is the right level of what is the right limit to set on our free plans in order to both provide for a great user experience on the free plan and also to be able to balance that with monetization. So here, so the question is like, well, how many users should we limit the free plan to? So the way we answered this question was essentially we looked across all of our free plans. We looked at how many collaborators there were on each free plan, and then we just looked at like, well, what are the percentiles? Like, what's the 90th percentile of collaboration? What's the 99th percentile of collaboration? And then based on how many plans there were at each level, we were able to set like what the right limit was. So that was kind of like this graph here on the right, obviously with the axes labeled. The other question that we had was more of like an operational question, was like, how do we split out what our revenue like that is considered self-serve and what is considered like sales assisted revenue? So this question, like, it's essentially like divvying up, like, well, what should the sales team own? What accounts should the sales team own? What accounts should the marketing team own? And what accounts should the self-serve marketing team own? So even though like this question kind of sounds, it sounds pretty basic, right? You take your accounts, you split them up, but it's actually a little bit deeper than that. Like we need to figure out, you know, what was like the historical journey of a customer before they monetized and became a customer? Did they come in through the self-serve channel? Did they come in through a sales assisted channel? And that requires us to look at the product history, the product usage history of a customer. And then the other kind of data point that we kind of need is, well, what is the firmographic profile of the customer? Like, how large is the customer? Are they a true enterprise customer? Are they a smaller business? Are they a growing customer? Are they a rapidly growing startup? These are like sort of the questions that we need to unify our different data sources to be able to come to like a complete picture of before we can successfully like categorize whether someone's considered self-serve or sales assist. The third question is also kind of like an operational question around like our sales and marketing operations. So like, what's the criteria for a product qualified lead? And for those who aren't familiar with the concept of a product qualified lead, essentially what a product qualified lead is if we look across all of our free plans, those are kind of the leads that currently exist in Zeplin. And some number of those free plans have done a set of like actions inside of the product that give them a really high propensity to convert and become a customer. So in that case, if they've done these things in the product, we refer to those leads as product qualified leads. And this is like kind of a deeper question because, you know, intuitively, we know what are some of the actions that you need to do inside the product to become an active customer. But it's like, how do we back that up with data? Who are our happiest customers that are constantly renewing or that are expanding their accounts? And what are the product actions they are doing? And then we take those product actions and then map them on to our free users. That's kind of like how we think about the methodology to successfully define a product qualified lead. And then, you know, in order to be able to actually do that analysis, we would need to be able to pull all of the data from both our product data as well as our transaction data. So that comes from like two data sources. That comes from Mongo, and that would come from Stripe. We would need to unify that data and then be able to come out with like an analysis of that data. And then like the fourth thing I think is actually pretty cool. So this is definitely like a marketing thing that comes up. Is like, how do we email users with an activity report? that shows their work in Zeplin. So you've probably received like this kind of email from like other applications where it's like, this week you've done like XYZ things in our application, and here's how much time you saved, here's how much value you've gotten out of it. But basically, like, how do we communicate the value that Zeplin is providing to our users? So we're actually and this, in order to do this, we need a lot of data around what the users are doing in Zeplin, and then we need to unify that data with our email, with our lifecycle marketing tool. So what we've basically been able to do here is to be able to pull metrics on like a user level, be able to process those metrics in a way that to get numbers that make sense to users, and then enrich that data inside of our email marketing tool. So if you're a Zeplin user, once a month you're going to get this sort of email, and then you're going to be able to see, well, look, I published like almost 120 screens in the last 30 days. I'm getting a lot of utilization out of Zeplin. And I would think about, and this helps me answer a question, is Zeplin delivering on its value? Are we helping product teams? Are we adding value to product teams? All right, so that was kind of the journey that we went through with setting up our data stack. We started with data from a bunch of different applications. We now send all that data into Mozart. Mozart handles the data transformations, and then using that clean data, we're able to do all these things, like some of the questions we've answered. And so much more. All right.
Great. Well, thanks, Jason. Thanks so much. I'd love to transition us to sort of just a conversation. And I want to go a little bit off script based on kind of your presentation and sort of the framing I had for kind of this fireside chat. So I'm Pete Fishman. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Mozart Data. So of course, we're very involved in Zeplin's data stack. But what I'm more interested in is basically this breadth of problems that you're tackling. It's not what we would traditionally think of as marketing, just like sort of marketing campaigns and understanding which marketing campaign is doing the best. It's much more operational. There's revenue ops, like figuring out kind of where the pricing, breakpoints happen. There's sort of business operations, which kind of also falls into that. I want to understand, how did this world transition from sort of the one that I described from my work in the 2000s, when I was a data analyst, the prehistoric time, probably like a decade before the prehistoric time, what you're calling the prehistoric time, but from my work to this new world where you're not just, turning to me to answer those questions, but you're answering them yourself. So I'd love to know, how do you think that sort of transition really happened, and why is there such a premium on sort of this growth role, and why has it expanded into kind of sort of just like beyond just looking at sort of campaigns and into sort of more of the key business questions?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. And the way I would think about it is that it really has to do with how go-to-market motions have changed over time, and how marketing roles have corresponded with like those go-to-market motions. So, back in the 2000s or like early 90s, marketing or software companies were primarily selling these huge enterprise contracts. At that point, the role of marketing was really around building air cover. So are we growing our awareness in amongst like our target market? And back then, like the way you would do marketing is the goal was just to generate greater awareness. Targeting was actually like pretty limited in those days. I think the next evolution of marketing was roughly in like the late 2010s and early 2020s, the mid 2010s was when targeting became much more sophisticated. You were able to say grab a list of your users, upload that into Facebook, generate lookalike audiences, and so on. And at that point, the role of marketing grew from just air cover to air cover plus lead gen. So in addition to saying like we're building awareness amongst these executives that's influencing our deals and so on, we're also able to say like, last week we spent this much money and we put these ads in front of these people, and like the following 30 people filled out our demo form, or the 30 people downloaded our white paper. And that level of transition, just required greater like data granularity. You needed to be able to see like exactly who you were targeting, who was in your like target list, what were these people doing. So that was kind of like the midpoint of the transition. I'd say the final transition was like roughly from like 2018 to kind of where we are today, which is marketing moved from not only just generating leads to doing full cycle sales. So what full cycle sales means is that you're taking these leads, you're giving them an experience of the application, and then they're actually just making a purchase, usually just by putting in their credit card, and then they become a subscriber without talking to anybody on your sales team. With that sort of full cycle sales, if you believe like the marketing team is responsible for that full cycle sales, you need to have a ton of fluency in your data to be able to know like, well, who are these people that are signing up? What are these people doing in the application? What package did they buy? When are they going to renew? And so on. So that's kind of like how I think about like the transition from where we started to where we are today, and why we need more sophisticated data tools.
Awesome. So I do want to remind the audience, we're going to sort of transition in a few minutes to taking some audience questions, but I want to just keep going on this point, and I want to sort of understand it a little bit better. I love the discussion of sort of the transitioning role of marketing as sort of we become, selling to more directly, effectively to prospects, and being more involved in the life cycle, and sort of that new world of sort of bottom up SaaS in the B2B space. So that really understands why like marketing is becoming more resourced, as in like, you have the sort of agency to make some decisions there, and around some of the parts and elements of your stack. How did data become sort of part of that conversation? You mentioned sort of data fluency being really important, but what about sort of having the rights to access a lot of that data, to generate a lot of that data, to make decisions about what to build and what to spend on with respect to data? How did that become ever part of the equation?
That's super interesting. I think just like earlier on, marketing and data teams, we're typically split into separate departments. And the way marketing would work with data was that data was just considered like a shared service within the company. So if people had questions, well, how many prospects that I'm generating from Facebook are adding a collaborator in their free account? That was a question where essentially the way you would do it is you can either look and see if your company already had a pre-built report, or you would file a Jira ticket. You would ask your data team, and your data team would get back to you in a few days based on kind of how busy they are and what the prioritization was. So that was how things worked in the old world. And the way I think about it is like, at certain companies, that sort of model does work. I'd say that for many companies that are just thinking about setting up their data stack now, they're thinking about how can we integrate data more closely into the day-to-day runnings of a marketing team or of a revenue team and so on. So then you would remove that layer of sort of back and forth, and you would give people direct access. This allows people to be more nimble. This allows people to be more flexible. And the last point is that I think you see this sort of like transition from shared service to like integrated into the team in a bunch of other functions. Like if you think about how Salesforce reporting used to work back in the day, like you would actually need to file a ticket and then ask somebody, well, like, can you tell me how productive my reps are? Nowadays, a sales manager can just pull up that report in Salesforce. They can go in, they can make changes, and then this whole like efficiency and nimbleness just allows teams to operate much better, and that's how we kind of think about it at Zeplin.
Awesome. I sort of want to dive more into the you. So, how has like data fluency like been kind of a theme in your career? How have you grown your sort of data capabilities, not just at Zeplin with Mozart, but also just sort of more broadly in your previous roles at a lot of great companies we admire. So how has like data been part of your career, and how did it sort of, and where do you see it sort of taking you from here?
Yeah, I got interested in, so I come from like a background I think a lot of growth marketers come from. So like it was, I've been in a lot of like very quantitative roles, and what really got me interested in growth marketing was how growth marketing was a hybrid or a synthesis between both like what looking at numbers, doing data modeling, with sort of a intuitive or scientific understanding of a customer. And like in the early days, a lot of the data that we did was just done in Excel or Google Sheets, and we maintained these massive spreadsheets I had mentioned. I think in recent years, various data tools have become much simpler to use. And I think like SQL proficiency is something that it's not something that I've had before, but it's something that I've just seen more and more like leading growth marketers in the field just pick up. So and I would encourage like other growth marketers who are starting today to just think about like what is like kind of the level of SQL proficiency that you would need to be able to navigate these like more complex data warehouses or data stacks, to be able to pull data quickly and just be able to iterate nimbly.
Yeah, I mean, from my own personal perspective, I'm seeing this sort of role trend. Obviously, the types of folks going into it are kind of like you said, this hybrid of like, scientist, but also somebody that sort of understands the human psychology. And so it's not surprising that the sort of data fluency of this role is just every year seems to be like getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And honestly. That's sort of part of the inspiration for our tool, Mozart, which is to empower these folks with the data engineering side. So I'm a little bit over in terms of my own questions. I'm going to turn to the audience for a quick one. Jason, are there other teams in Zeplin using Mozart? If so, what departments sort of leverage the tool, and what projects is it sort of critical for them to do that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we definitely have other teams using Mozart. I'd say the key teams are kind of the go-to-market teams. So marketing, sales for all of the things I mentioned, like who's a product qualified lead, what's the customer health, and similarly our customer success team for figuring out what's the customer health, what's the customer adoption of the product. Our support team to handle like debugging and to understand like just the context of a customer when the support ticket comes through. And of course, and lastly, I think our product and engineering team use Mozart. They use Mozart to figure out what are the features that we should be building next? How do we inform a product roadmap? And with Mozart, you're able to do a lot of like you're able to do a lot of like just very interesting things. So one example is we're looking into building a certain product, and this product was inspired because we were just looking through kind of the account names and project names of of people that are building things in Zeplin, and we noticed that people were sort of hacking Zeplin, and by coming up with just project names that were by coming up with they were sort of hacking Zeplin's like organization system by coming up with like project names that were meant to be like searchable but not actually like informative about like what the project did. So as a result, what we did was we're looking into like building out better, stronger organizational features and foldering features inside of Zeplin to be able, based on that sort of like insight that now that the project team can quickly like look through data about how our customers are using Zeplin.
Okay, so we've got another Mozart data question, which is, but more broadly data stack question, which is, when is the sort of ideal time to set up your data stack? And then, how do you, as say, someone in growth or somebody in BizOps or RevOps, how does someone like you go about sort of making the case for it or get buy-in sort of more broadly in the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. For the timing, I think the academic answer would be as soon as possible. But I would say like the realistic answer is this. Early on in your growth as a company, there's a bunch of tools that are not that do reporting, but they don't do it from like a data warehouse approach. So like you can scrape by just looking at your reports in Amplitude or in Mixpanel. And then you can also scrape by looking at like the built-in reports in Stripe. The downside of that is that you're going to be, when you want to join data or when you want to look at like data with you want to look at like greater volumes of data, you're gonna really struggle. So I think like the practical answer is like whenever your spreadsheets become unmanageable, or whenever your like homemade like data infrastructure that's sort of done on Google Sheets become unmanageable. So yeah, that's kind of like how I think about it. And I think like the ROI or like making a case for building a data stack, that's usually like something that's like something I think that's like fairly straightforward. Just because you're gonna realize that these sort of data problems exist in every single department. So by if you can uncover these sort of problems, you're probably gonna have a business case where you're gonna say like, hey, 50% of this company will benefit from building a data warehouse, and at that point the ROI becomes just very evident.
Yeah, if I were to answer the same question, I have a very biased answer. Of course, my answer is the same as your academic answer, which is you should do it as soon as possible. You should do it yesterday. It's very important to set up your data and your data infrastructure right as early as possible, because that's just going to pay dividends in the future, and you want to be collecting as much of that data as early as possible. I think your intuition about kind of once you start joining data is kind of what we see in our customers, that, like you said, a lot of the sort of SaaS tools have built-in reporting and work as sufficiently as standalone tools as you start to generate data. Once you start answering questions, and the first one that you brought up in your presentation was, where should I cut my free plan? And now you have something sort of company specific, around usage. But what you need there is to combine your product data and sort of information about sort of like your leads or your opportunities or your companies. And that requires sort of combining multiple data sets to answer like sort of 1 degree harder of a question than sort of just how many companies are there, or how many people are doing thing X. So that's kind of also when I see just sort of more broadly this to be true for most of our customers, that ideally you implement a data stack at the very beginning, but really you need a data stack once you start answering questions that involve sort of combining data across sources. Awesome. Well, sort of just going to do a very quick last call for sort of audience questions, and then kind of I'm going to ask just sort of Jason, one more question, just sort of in closing. So, you listed a lot of great questions, right? These are the questions that you're answering, but where do these questions come from? So a lot of the sort of value, of data is not about the data infrastructure. I mean, I would love it to be all about the data infrastructure, and I think you've made a great choice with Mozart. But in practice, a lot of the value comes from the individuals, the ones that ask the right questions of the data. Where do these questions come? Where did these come from? Are these all coming from you? Are these coming from folks in your org? Is it coming from across the company? Where are these questions coming from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in general, like these sort of data questions that I've sort of uncovered are sort of like go-to-market questions, and that's where I have kind of the most experience. And when I think about like go-to-market questions, they're usually questions around one of two things. Like one is, how do we generate more leads? Like how do we get more volume? And then two is, how do we get more conversions? So how do we get more of our leads to turn to customers? That's kind of how, and then like maybe thirdly, there's like also a question around like operationally, like how do we split up different functions throughout the company so that the right teams are owning the right like portfolio of customers. That's sort of where the questions, that's sort of where like the go-to-market questions really stem from. I think more on like the product and support side, those questions are like that's like a separate basket of questions. And that usually, at least in my observation, and I'm not a PM or a support engineer, but in my observation, like those questions usually come from like you usually build some sort of hypothesis based on your day-to-day interactions of listening to your customers. And then you would need to use the data to validate your hypothesis. So like you say like, I keep on talking to customers that want to do X. Like let me go look into our database to see how many customers truly want to do X. And that is how I think product roadmaps are informed.
Awesome. Well, first off, a huge thank you, Jason. Thanks for joining us on this fireside chat. Really appreciate your presentation and then your answering a variety of questions from me, from the audience, etc. Thank you everyone for coming. Of course, if you're interested in centralizing your data and setting up a modern data stack, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm Pete@mozartdata.com. You can email Amadeus@mozartdata.com. You can find more information at mozartdata.com. But I'm happy just to talk in general about all things data and sort of data infrastructure. So don't think of it as just a Mozart data type conversation. For the attendees or anybody that missed, we'll be sending out a recording tomorrow. Thank you all again for attending and have a great day.
Thanks so much, everyone.